Hey folks, Mr. Olson here. We're continuing our analysis of aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And the question we're asking with this lesson is what happens in the long run? So let's start with this economy. This economy is running at full employment output. It's at its potential GDP, and the current unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment because the short run equilibrium is along the LARS on the left, and because the current output on the business cycle, the yellow dot right here, is along the trend line potential GDP for the economy. Let's analyze what happens if consumer spending increases in the short run and then in the long run. First, because consumer spending is a determinant of aggregate demand, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. The price level is going to increase, real GDP is going to increase, and unemployment is going to decrease. Okay, this red dot on the ASAD model on the left-hand side represents the same idea as being a peak up here of the business cycle. The economy is running hot, and there is demand pull inflation, unemployment's nice and low, and we are now at our short run equilibrium. So this is what we did with the last lesson. I know we're in the short run because our short run equilibrium is not along the LARS. Okay. Now, this is where we're going to end up in the short run. The next question is what happens in the long run. Okay. And in macroeconomics, what determines the long run is what happens to wages. And when you're in the long run, wages are flexible. Okay. So in this particular example, because the price level's high and unemployment is really, really low, eventually in the long run, workers are going to demand higher wages because the price level's higher. Their rent is more expensive, their groceries are more expensive, and their tuition for Archbishop Moody High School is more expensive. So eventually they're going to demand higher wages from their employers. And in the long run, they're going to get them. Additionally, because that unemployment rate is so low, let's say, for example, the unemployment rate is 3%. There are so few workers available out there looking for jobs that to attract workers when firms have availability, they're going to need to offer higher and higher wages. So, as you know, wages are a resource that firms pay. And so if the wages increase, that's going to decrease the short run aggregate supply curve back to the left until we reach our long run equilibrium along the LARS again. This is why the business cycle always comes back down. What goes up must come back down. When the economy gets overheated, price levels get so high that eventually wages follow, which decreases aggregate supply and brings us back to the trend line. Okay, so this is what happens in the long run. In the short run, we were in an inflationary gap at the red dot, also known as a positive output gap. And then in the long run, we returned to our full potential real GDP output. And the reason is because wages changed and followed the price level changes. All right, let's do another example the other way. Okay, let's imagine that consumer spending decreases. What's going to happen in the short run? And then after that, what's going to happen in the long run? I'd encourage you to pause the video, see if you can do it on your own, and then we'll go over it together. Okay, so if consumer spending decreases, let's say because of government shutdowns, because of a COVID-19 pandemic, there's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. This is where we're going to hit in terms of our short run equilibrium. As you can see, the price level fell, real GDP fell, and unemployment increased. That is our new short run equilibrium at the green dot, also represented here on the business cycle. Okay, so this is our short run equilibrium. What's going to happen in the long run? Wages are going to follow price changes. Okay, so in the short run, we often say wages are sticky. In other words, wages are staying the same. Okay. However, in the long run, wages are going to follow price level changes. So because the price level's down and unemployment's really, really high, eventually firms are going to be able to pay lower wages. In the long run, wages and other costs like renting land and borrowing money to rent capital or are going to borrowing money to purchase capital are going to eventually decrease as well. So price level goes down, eventually in the long run, wages decrease. And if wages decrease, that's going to increase aggregate supply until, again, we end up along our full employment trend line. So that's the long run adjustment. There's a double shift for the long run adjustment whereas in the short run, we just had the single shift. All right, let's do some practice questions together. Pause the video, try this one on your own, and then we'll do it together. Number one, assume there's an increase in government spending. What happens to the price level and output in the short run? You got to pay attention to the wording, because in the short run means that we're just going to have the single shift happen. So increase in government spending shifts aggregate demand to the right, because government spending is a determinant of aggregate demand, which is going to increase our price level and increase our product, our quantity of real output in the short run. That's it for this question. Number two, pause the video, try it on your own, then we'll do it together. Okay, here we go. Consumer expectations fall and consumer spending plummets. What happens to price level and output in the long run? Okay, so this question's different. In the long run, we know that wages are flexible, and we know that we're going to settle again eventually along the LARS. Okay, so you got to read the question on these very carefully. So, but the only way to get to the long run is by going through the short run. The only way to get to the long run is by going through the short run. So let's do it. Consumer expectations fall. That's going to lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which leads to a short run drop in prices. So there's deflation happening, and a short run decrease in real GDP. Okay. However, in the long run, eventually, if the price level's down, then the cost of resources like wages are going to follow suit. So prices are down, GDP's down, there's not that much competition for workers, and eventually workers are going to accept lower wages, which means we have an increase in aggregate supply, and then we have a new long-run equilibrium at PL2 and at the quantity of output QY along the LARS. So to answer the question, the price level decreases a lot, but output stays the same. So in the long run, output stays the same, and the economy is going to self-adjust and self-correct to return to full employment output. Number three, try this one on your own, and then we'll go over it together. If consumer spending, what happens to price level and output in the long run? The only way to get to the long run is to go through the short run. Consumer spending increases, we have a short run increase in price level and a short run increase in real GDP, and a short run decrease in unemployment. Unemployment is so low, eventually to attract new workers, firms are going to have to pay higher wages, and firms and workers are going to demand higher wages because the price level is going up. So their basket of goods that they buy each month is going up. So eventually wages are going to increase, and when wages increase, that decreases aggregate supply and brings us to our new long-run equilibrium where the price level increases, but output stays the same. So the idea here is the economy is going to self-correct, and we're always going to settle along our LARS. And in fact, that's where our LARS is derived from. It's the net of all these wages catching up long-run adjustments to have us settle at our full employment potential output. Here's a multiple choice question from the 2008 audit exam. Pause the video, see if you can get the answer on your own. For this question, you can see that we're in the short run. How do we know we're in the short run? Because our real GDP is not along the LARS, right? Our real output is beyond our potential output. So we know we must be in a short run equilibrium. In the long run, what's going to happen? Wages are going to increase, which will decrease our short run aggregate supply curve to the left and bring us back to our full employment long run equilibrium. Correct letter choice on that one is E. All right, so let's connect this to real economic growth. So far, our real GDP returned to exactly where it was before it started. Let's analyze how we can actually increase GDP over the long run, okay? And it has to do with investment spending. So take a look at this problem. If investment increases, what happens in the short run and the long run? We already know in the short run what's going to happen, because investment, which is businesses spending on tools, factories, and machinery, is going to increase aggregate demand because it's a determinant of aggregate demand. So in the short run, what happens? Price level increases, real GDP increases, and unemployment decreases. Okay. Now, investment spending is different than other types of expenditures, however, because investment spending means in the long run, we have a higher capital stock. And our capital stock in the economy is the amount of machinery and tools purchased by businesses that increase their output. So if our capital stock is higher, we have higher levels of productivity in the economy. And if we have higher levels of productivity, then our short run aggregate supply curve is actually going to increase to the right. So the difference here from the last ones is because we have more capital stock, the productivity increase is going to drag the short run aggregate supply curve to the right. So what that means is because we have an increase in productivity, we're going to have a triple shift where the LARS is actually going to increase to the right. Our potential GDP in our economy has grown because we have higher capital stock and therefore higher productivity, and our LARS is going to shift to the right. You guys already understand this concept from way back in Unit 1. This is the equivalent of the PPC shifting outward, right? We can produce more of everything, in this case, more capital goods and consumer goods, because our capital stock is higher. Okay. The difference between this problem and the other ones we did earlier is that the shift in aggregate demand was caused by a change in investment spending. And the other examples, it was just consumer spending or government spending or maybe net exports changing. So that means we're going to settle along our original LARS curve. However, if investment spending changes, then we're going to get a triple shift and real economic growth. Let's do some more practice with these. Pause the videos. This is not practice, sorry. This is what I just said verbally. An increase in consumption or government spending doesn't cause economic growth, only investment does, because firms increase their capital stock. Okay, this is why governments are concerned and are very interested in incentivizing investment spending for firms, because it allows for real economic growth in the long run. There's a practice question related to this concept. Here's another one. Pause the video, see how you do. This is an example of a government policy to incentivize investment spending. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there's a practice FRQ in the Milk Guide if you want to give it a try. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening. Bye.